talking about here a little bit, the training topic we're going to be talking about is how we set our max bids. And this is actually, it's one of the most important things that you do as a tax sale investor. It's how much you're willing to pay for properties. This is one of the places where we see a lot of people make mistakes. In fact, it's very common for people that are unaware of how tax sales really work to come in and to automatically overpay, because all they really are familiar with is traditional real estate investing. And this is not traditional real estate. We're coming in from the perspective as wholesalers, essentially. That's what the county is doing for us. They're selling it to us, with clouded titles, essentially, so that they can sell the properties off and not have any responsibility necessarily with the properties. But for us, though, what it means is that we are wholesalers. We don't want to pay anywhere close to market value. In fact, we're the ones who should be paying the lowest price on the property, because we have to take the property and clear the title for it. We're the one taking it directly from the county and their foreclosure into the sales market. And so we need to make sure that we're picking it up for a good low percentage of value, so that number one, we can get the property sold, but also so that it's easier to sell. And ideally, when we sell it, the person that we sell it to could also be an investor, and they can also make money on it. That's essentially why we need to be able to pick it up for wholesale pricing, is because who we're going to sell it to is most likely going to be an investor as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we have really 3 different steps that we teach our students. And for those members on the line, you know this. We have stage 1 due diligence that has 6 steps, and we really call that basic property research. If it passes stage 1 due diligence, then we may move on to stage 2 due diligence, which has another 6 steps. And that's about really researching the title and the deed, looking for those things like those government issued liens. And then stage 3 due diligence has 3 steps as well. And with this, what we're going to be focusing on today is how do we set our max bids. So this is one of the steps in stage 3 research that we're going to be talking about and covering today.
Yeah, I mean, the idea between the stages is that you obviously don't want to sink a lot of time. I mean, your time is your most valuable resource, and you don't want to sink a lot of time into every property. You only want to sink time into properties if they have the potential to work. And the only way you're going to know that is by conducting certain research on them. And so what we do is we have our research set up in stages so that we can ensure that properties justify the research that we're going to put into them. So with stage 1, this is where we're figuring out if the numbers are going to work or not. It's all the surface level stuff, but it's the important stuff that makes for the numbers of the deal. But in stage 2 due diligence, it's really about trying to find potential risks that are associated with the property. It's things that are attached to the title. And so it's title research that we're doing. But stage 3 is really where it all kind of comes together. This is where we take what we've been able to figure out here about the property. This is also where we would take something like an on-site evaluation, so photos of the property, looking at the condition, and we would, between those, figure out what our max bid should be based on the value. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how we come up with those max bids and where the percentages should be on properties, whether you're investing into land or homes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we see on our Facebook post or on our YouTube videos all the time about how high should I go on bidding on a property. This is kind of what we're going to be talking about today, is determining our bid amount based on what type of property we're bidding on. It obviously makes less sense to spend a lot of money on a $10,000 lot, paying 50% of value, pay $5,000 for a $10,000 lot, when we're talking about a piece of land that's still a tax deed foreclosure. And so what we're going to do is go over those guidelines and show you how much we're willing to pay for the different types of properties that we come across, whether that be land property or something like a structured property. We have a system in place where we set our max bid based on the property value, and then also based on the condition when we're talking about homes and structured property.
Yeah, we separate the two because I guess we have different percentages for different types of properties, a little bit different for land and improved properties. But there are a lot of reasons why this is important, and I think we'll probably get into them a little bit here as we talk about each one of them. With land, though, the way that this system works here, we're going to start off with the lowest price and kind of work our way up. And we do that because, again, we want everyone to kind of understand the percentages that we're going to be working at and where we'll start at with a lot of properties. So if land is valued at less than $10,000 or up to $10,000, we're generally trying to get that property for close to 10 cents on the dollar. 5 to 15 cent is what we could say here. But really we're trying to get 5 cents, maybe 10 cents on the dollar is what we're going to be looking at, and is really what makes for a better deal. This property in the example is a good example of it. Property costs $340, is valued at about 8,000. That's a good example of a wholesale deal and a property, that is picked up for about 5% or under 5% of its value.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing we probably should clarify when we talk about wholesale value, when we talk about wholesale value, the terminology of what that means has changed since me and Shade first got started. When we talked about wholesale back when we first got started, it was about buying a property for cheap, turning around and selling it for cheap, but still making a good potential profit. So buy a property for $1,000 that's worth 12 grand, sell it for 6 grand, keep that difference. Now the word wholesale means for a lot of people doing what's called paper flips, getting contracts and then reselling that property. And so when we talk about wholesale, what we're really talking about is buying a tax deed and then selling it to another investor or to another buyer at a discount where we haven't gone through the process of quieting the title. So we haven't gone through the legal process. We haven't spent the money. If we're looking at a $10,000 lot, it doesn't make sense for us as the buyer and then again the seller to go ahead and spend a couple of grand to go through quiet title. It makes more sense for us to sell that to somebody who wants to hold on to the property, maybe as an investment, or maybe to eventually build on it. And then if they want to go through quiet title, they can after they purchased it, but we are essentially giving it to them for a discount because we're selling it as is.
Yeah, I mean, the real value in picking the property up there for a low percentage of value comes in our ability to sell it for a low percentage of value as well. So if you've only paid 5% for the property, I mean, at $340, what you can sell the property for is pretty much, up to you. But it wouldn't be hard to get a sell here in this deal. I mean, obviously anything over $500, would be profitable for you. It's just a matter of how profitable you want to be. And so, you can set prices at a lot of different points here. But if we were to sell this property, in order to find a buyer, sometimes we have to discount the price and attract buyers by offering them a good deal, the opportunity to make money. In which case we might sell the property for 50% of what it's worth, or sometimes maybe even less. It all depends on how quickly we want to get a deal done, and how much money we're leaving on the table versus how quickly we can make that transaction work. So let's look at another example here, just so we can see how this starts to build and change. Because as the value goes up, so does the percentage of value that we're willing to pay. But again, we're going to keep that towards the lower end of the spectrum whenever we can. So properties valued between 10 and 20,000, we could pay between 10 and 20% of value. But we're always going to try to lean towards the lower end of that, if possible. If I can get a $20,000 property at 10% of value, then I'm that much better off, because again, I paid a low percentage of value. It leaves me with, quite a bit more there when it comes to my ability to sell the property and to offer it for a low price. If I paid a high percentage for it, or if I paid, let's say, 25% for this property, I'm going to have to turn around and sell it for at least, a much higher amount than I would if I paid a lower amount. Basically, it just makes it easier to sell, when it's a lower price. Common sense.
Yeah, exactly. And at that $10,000 price point, we're going to be at that 10%, being kind of the max amount. But as we get up to closer to 20, then maybe we're willing to pay 15 cents on the dollar. And for the right property that maybe is going up in value, maybe would pay 20 cents. But really, we're trying to keep it for under 15 cents on the dollar in this particular class. And we can see here from the property example, this is a property that sold for $1,350, was worth about 15 grand. This is a property you could turn around and flip very easy. Would probably take this property and would sell it wholesale as is, but we're getting into the territory where if it's cheap enough, we could look at doing something like quiet title. We also, if we had the right buyer, maybe we use something like tax title services where we can offer title insurance on it, even though it's a tax deed property. And so when we're looking at this category, we're usually doing wholesale, but we may start looking at doing some legal action if the property deal makes sense.
It's also worth mentioning that it's deals like these ones right here that are the way that a lot of students have kind of built up their capital, or build up some of their working capital. It's with deals like these. So they're picking up these properties, turning around and selling these to increase their working capital that they have. And these deals are pretty straightforward. They're not overly expensive. You see, this one costs $1,300, which is not bad at all for a $15,000 piece of property. But it's a good example of another piece of land. But let's see, as they go up in value though, so $20,000 to $50,000 range in value, we're going to be between 10 and up to 30%, of value on. So our percentage increases up to about 30% if the value is there, on the higher end of that. But again, we're going to try for the lower, or we're going to try for the lower percentage if we can. So if a property is valued at 50,000, we could pay up to 30% on it, but we're generally going to try to get it for as low as we can.
Yeah, exactly. And as we get into this price point, this is where we're probably going to take the property through quiet title. Now, any of these we can still wholesale. We can still sell them as is. In fact, we may have an investor come up to us and want to be able to buy that property. We had one of our students, coaching students years ago, that ended up purchasing a property off of the county, and then somebody contacted him the next day seeing that the property had been purchased and offered him, additional $50,000 more than what they paid for the property. So even though he maybe was planning on going through quiet title on this piece of land, it made more sense to quickly flip it, make some good profit, and then put that money back into new investments. So in looking at this property, we can see it got picked up for $6,700, was valued about $30,000. So in this case, the buyer could either wholesale the property, or they could go ahead and go through quiet title. Maybe it cost them a couple of grand. They're into it, maybe less than 10 grand. They sell it for 30, they can make $20,000 on the deal.
Yeah, and you've got a lot of options as well when you're at that. If you wanted to wholesale the property, you could probably list it there at a lower price. Let's say you list it wholesale for 20,000. You could still be, it could still be a good profitable deal if you can find a buyer at that price, which you may be able to do. And that may not be a problem. But by paying a good low percentage of value, though, you make it possible. When you pay a high percentage of value, it just limits the number of buyers you can potentially sell to. As we get up to the properties class 4, so this would be pieces of land valued between 50 to 100,000, our percentage jumps up to 40%, that we could pay as a maximum bid. So properties valued at 100,000, we could pay upwards of 40,000, but obviously we're trying to get it for less if we can. But the numbers would justify that amount just based on values and based on our potential profitability. So this property in the example is actually a good one, because it is, you can see it's a piece of acreage. I don't know how many acres, maybe 5 to 10 acres. It was acquired, it's valued at 100,000, acquired for 27,000. So they ended up paying about 27% for it. But it has pretty good profitability here in it, because there's about $70,000 potential profit in that price point.
Yeah, exactly. So this type of property, it makes sense to go ahead and spend the extra couple of grand to go through quiet title. Maybe, after all, everything's been said and done, we put 30 grand into it, but we have $70,000 worth of potential profit there. And one thing to consider is when we're selling things as is, these need to be cash buyers. So they need to have the money up front to be able to pay us so that we can transfer the property into their name. When we get these more expensive properties, the reason it makes sense to go through the quiet title process is because somebody can get title insurance, which means that they can get a loan on the property. And so, that's one of the big advantages of taking a tax deed through quiet title and receiving a warranty deed, which we talk about more in other videos, is because obviously you have the ability to sell it using having quiet title done, where you get the warranty deed, where you can go ahead and sell it for full market value.
Yeah. By the way, I can see some of your guys' questions coming in, so that is excellent. We will cover those here in a bit, but yeah, I do see those coming in. So thank you for that. We'll cover those here in a few. All right, and yeah, let's see, as property values go up, numbers continue to make sense. Over 100,000, the number jumps up to 50% of value. Because again, there's more potential profitability there. The numbers can work if we're going to pay up to that amount. And this example is a good one to show those numbers. So we have a property here that's valued at about 120,000 that was acquired for 46,000, which leaves a potential profit there of about $70,000. roughly give or take some. But this is a great example of the kind of property, because this is probably one that we would take through quiet title, to sell for full market, just because there's no reason to leave that much money on the table. And property acreage like this also shouldn't be too hard to sell, especially when you've paid a lower percentage of value like this, so you have flexibility on your prices. A lot of people that own land don't really have all that much flexibility on their pricing, because they may have paid full price for the property. So we're in that unique position of paying low percentages of value, enabling us to sell it for a lot less than anybody else can.
Yeah, in fact, I think that more money can be made in class 3 through 5 of land than even in structured properties, homes, things like that, because we don't have to worry about the rehab component. We don't have to worry about the cost that is involved in rehab, and land is what it is. So if we have a good piece of land and we pick it up for cheap enough, the most expensive or our biggest cost may be going through quiet title. I guess we could have a survey done and a perk test and a couple of those type of things if we really wanted to, but our cost is minimal and our profit margins are high. So even if they put, if they were into a total of 50,000, bought it for 46, spend an extra 3 or 4 grand quieting the title, maybe having a survey done, something like that, and then it's valued at 120. Even if they sold it for 100,000, they're still making, $50,000 profit on that deal, and can put that money into more deals. And so, we really love higher valued land. We think there's a huge opportunity in purchasing these type of properties in the tax sale.
Well, and the one thing that you don't get with higher, with land like this, is you don't get improvement costs. You don't get, misevaluations on what's wrong with the property. You don't get missed, you don't miss things with the condition that can cost you a lot of money. The things that can cost you money are generally things that are just going to increase your profitability, like like going through quiet title action there, or getting surveys done on the property, or simple things like that. With land, tend to make the property more profitable. It's different than the way that it is with improved properties, where if you get the wrong idea about the condition of a property and you pay too much for it, you could find yourself literally in a situation where it's hard to get rid of, where it's hard to find a buyer at the price point that you're at. And that's why land really is a bigger risk for investors than, homes are a bigger risk to investors than land any day, just because of that potential for repair. And because we're trying to base the condition of the property on what we can see, and hopefully off of current images. But if not current images, it's really easy to make that mistake as well.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of how we look at land. Even that 50 cents on the dollar, that would really have to be the prime piece of land that's in an area that's really going up in value, or is really a hot market. Otherwise, we're usually going to be trying to get it for under 30 cents on the dollar, 35 cents on the dollar for the top properties. But there is a lot of potential. Next, we're going to talk about structured properties. And when we're talking about structured properties, this can include homes, condominiums, commercial properties, anything that essentially has a structure on it. But it's so important when we're looking at structured properties to evaluate the condition. The condition is going to be so important in setting our max bid amount.
Yeah, it's especially important with tax sale properties, because usually when we're looking at tax sale properties, we're looking at them following the end of a redemption period. Okay, so in whatever state they happen to be in, they could have a redemption period ranges from 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. But with these tax sale properties specifically, they don't get foreclosed on until they've had all of that time period, delinquent taxes basically, and waited out. In other words, the county can't take action on the property until the redemption period is passed. So with a lot of the land, it's possible that, some of these properties there, that somebody could have passed away. If the property is vacant now, you have to wonder how long has it been vacant, because it could have been vacant for a very long time. And so when Steve says the condition, is key, it's very important. It's crucial, because the condition is the difference between a property that may be usable versus a property that just needs to be torn down, and it essentially is a money pit. The only way we're going to know the difference between those two is through images that we get of the property and other details that we can learn about them through our research. And so, yeah, online evaluations or on-site evaluations are they are a must for improved properties. And it's because we can't usually trust the online information. Now, in some cases, counties will actually provide images of the property. And sometimes they'll even provide, interior images of the property. That's great. When we can get images from the county that are current, like if they're taking images of the property for the sale, then that is the best situation you can get, because they can show you images and have access to the property that you couldn't get on your own. In other words, if you were just on your own, you'd be lucky to get images of the outside of the property from a few different angles here, but you're not gonna be able to get all of that. So nothing is better than having the images directly from the county. But if we don't have that, then we can't trust most online sources, even if they don't appear to be that old. So 2 years might not seem like like that long of a time period, but it is. It's a long time when a property is sitting vacant, and it's a long time for things to go wrong. So whatever the time period is here, we need to get images of the property that allow us to see what it looks like right now, so that we can, determine what that condition is like and how much work we think the property is going to need, because that's how we're going to determine our max bid.
Yeah, in fact, we were doing a webinar a couple of weeks ago with our membership, and we were going over and looking at that exact thing. We were looking at properties where we looked at the online evaluation or the online photos from, say, something like Google Maps. And within a year, of that time, then we were looking at photos that were current photos. And over that year period of time, we saw all kinds of issues on the property. We went from a property that was being lived in to a property that was partially boarded up, windows were open, roof was damaged, weeds were out of control. And so in those different types of examples, we can never trust the online information. We've always got to do that on-site evaluation to make sure that what we're buying, is in condition that it can be repaired. You don't know how many times that we've attended an auction and seen two people there local. These are local people, mind you, that are bidding against each other on a property that we drove by, and we know that that property has been burnt down. And all they're doing is they're trusting the online information. They didn't go out there and view the property, and they're bidding against each other, thinking that each one of them had done the due diligence. So that's part of the reason why it's so important.
It's also really important, especially at the lower price point. So the lower the value of the improved property, the bigger the risk it is for an investor. What that means is that the first couple of classes that we have here, class 1, class 2 properties, they are they're properties that are probably, or in many cases, properties we might avoid. Unless we can determine the condition on them is really good, we're going to avoid them, because there's the potential here for things to go wrong, and for these properties to actually need more work than what they're even worth. And so that's one of the reasons why we have to be very careful with these, is because it's easy for them to be money pits, when they don't have a lot of value. And that's because it's very simple for something like a roof repair, which can cost X amount regardless of how much the property's worth. And let's say you've got a roof repair that's going to cost $10,000 to $12,000 regardless of property value. If the property's only valued at $30,000, that's an issue, because again, you're sinking a lot of money into a property that's probably not going to ever really be worth much more than that 30,000. We have a value limited property, and that's what we've got to look out for. So class 1 properties, those valued between $10,000 and $30,000, we're going to be paying about 10 to 15% of value on. Most of these are probably going to be mobile homes with land. If they're not, there could be homes, in this price range. If you could get a condo in this range, it would be awesome. Condos, are always good opportunities here. But yeah, lower valued homes. This is a good example with this mobile home at $2,600. It's about the right price point here, where you're not into it too deep. You can get out of it very easily. At that price point, you could turn around at 5,000 and double your money. So that's a good price point to be at with this property, just because you can wholesale it relatively easy. And if you need to put some money into it, you could put in some, because you're at a low enough price point. You could at least, you may need to do things like get the property more presentable or easier to sell. And that may include stuff like, getting landscaping work done, getting garbage hauled off. It can mean some different things like that, where you may have some expenses, but you want to limit your expenses here with a deal like this, just because there's not a lot of money you can really sink into it.
Yeah, in fact, Shade brings up a real good point. The only type, excuse me, the only type of properties that we really target in this range are going to be mobile homes on their own piece of land. Or maybe a mobile home on a mobile home lot that we talk about in one of our videos. But in this particular situation, it's really going to be the example like this. In fact, we picked up a mobile home a couple of months ago at an auction that we paid $2,000 for, and it was very similar to this property. If we can get that, then we've got a mobile home lot, which means that we have power, water, sewer, all of those kind of hookups already on the lot, which really means it's an improved lot. And then with the mobile home, like like Shade said, we can either wholesale that, we can fix the property up and use it as a rental, but that's really the only category. Usually with a $30,000 home, we're going to avoid it unless somehow we can see that it's in great condition, because there's just not enough profit in there. If you were to go in a home and you have to replace the roof or do something like that, that could be $10,000 that could wipe out any profit.
Yeah, the real value in these properties is in the improved lot itself. In having the lot with all the hookups there, the improvements for the mobile home. And so if you have a mobile home on there that is usable, then that's great. But the property itself has pretty good value, just alone, because people know they can bring in. There's lots of people that are looking for for their own piece of land that they can put their trailer on, so they don't have to pay lot fees, and so they can make it semi-permanent basically. So yeah, let's see what happens here as values go up here on properties. So $30,000 to $60,000 range, our percentage of value we can pay jumps up to about 25%. And this also expands, the range of properties, but in a lot of ways, though, we're still looking at some of the same types of properties. Though we could still be looking at mobile homes with land. They might just be a little bit nicer. This is also where we're going to start to see condos, and other homes, for sale here. You could find commercial stuff in this price range as well that could be, a pretty good opportunity. In fact, it's like this property here, that was picked up. It was picked up for
Yeah, for 23 grand. It was valued at over 50 grand. But this is actually one of the properties that was picked up by one of our students, one of our coaching members. They ended up picking up for 23,000, and then they actually sold it as is to somebody who ended up paying 50,000. They made $27,000 profit and were able to do it pretty quickly. So this is kind of what we'll do with a lot of these different type of properties. We may go ahead and do what we call lipstick rehab, which is just, fixing it so that it's good enough to either turn around and sell or to rent out. We're not going to be putting marble countertops in a property like this, but we're going to go ahead and paint, carpet, and then turn around and sell it, or doing something like this student did where she just found a buyer. Maybe the property was worth 60 grand. She sold it to him for a discount and then was able to take that additional profit, put that back into more property.
Yeah, I mean, the advantage that you have with this is people are always looking for, affordable housing, a place to live. And so because, you picked it up at a good low price point there at 23,000 versus its value, it's not that hard to sell. And the evidence that it's not that hard to sell is that she sold it wholesale, for double the price there. And so made pretty good money on it without actually needing to fix the title, or even fix up the property. So the money that was made on this property was made just by virtue of it being bought well. Being bought at a good low price, so they can turn around and sell it to another investor. And the investor that buys it will probably make money on it as well through the purchase. So it's one of the things we can offer to buyers that's nice.
Yeah, when we talk about class three, that's where we move up between $60,000 to $100,000 in value. So for class three properties, really we're looking to spend about 10 to 35% of the property's value. This can obviously include, some lower end condos, homes. We can get into some kind of commercial property within this category, industrial property. In fact, this is a pretty good example. This example is actually a couple of years old. It was an incredible deal they ended up picking up. They picked up this home for $8,500, and it was valued about $80,000. Now, actually, this property, since this deal was done, has actually pretty much doubled in value. So over the last couple of years, this property has gone up quite a bit, but they were renting this property out for $1,400 a month. This is probably one of the better deals that one of our students have purchased, because they were able to pay for the property within a matter of 6 months. And every single month since then, they've been building residual income. Plus, the property has gone up in value, which has doubled their overall profit.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that property is going to triple in value, before very long. It's just a great buy, in a good area there where values are going up. And so, yeah, a deal like this is very easy to sell, because it's highly desirable there, and the numbers work. As the value goes up, again, we can pay up to 45 or 50% on properties, but we don't do it with very many of them. In other words, if we're looking at a lot of properties there in an auction, it might take a bid of 50% to win that property, but it doesn't mean we're going to put a bid of 50% in, just because it's not always worth it. We don't want to win the property at that high of a price, especially if we have concerns about the condition or things that may be wrong with the property, because you could easily lose, a good chunk of money there with a few things being wrong at this price point. So, in other words, we might go up to as high as 45% of value on property. So, this property we're looking at here, could it be worth paying upwards of $45,000 for it? You could. I mean, reasons why we might pay a higher price point, would be if it's newer a little bit, so if it's not as old, or if there's signs that it's been recently remodeled or rehabbed, those are indications or reasons why we might be able to pay a little bit higher percentage of value. But if we don't see signs of that, then we're going to try to keep that percentage of value down as low as we can, just because we need that additional space if something does go wrong with the property. So we're better off trying to pick it up for 35% of value and losing it, than we are, paying 55% of value and winning it.
Yeah, I completely agree with Shade. And one thing that we need to consider is those rehab costs. So, if we were looking at this particular example, and let's say that we saw that it was in worse condition, maybe the roof looked rough, the outside looked like it needed work, the yard was a mess, then would probably try to get that property for 10 to 20 cents on the dollar, because we know that there's going to be a lot of rehab cost involved with it. Looking at the way it is currently, it looks like the roof is okay. The yard looks to be in okay shape. Overall, it looks like a pretty sound structure. Well, it would probably maybe pay up to 35 cents on the dollar. Now, let's say we were looking at this property and it was a home that was only 10 years old in a nice neighborhood. That's the kind of property that we may pay up to 45 cents on the dollar, but it would also be a property upwards of that $200,000 price point. So maybe a home that's worth 100 to 50 to 200,000, maybe if it's in a good enough condition, then we'd be willing to pay 45 cents on the dollar, and we're willing to pay up for that property because we know we're going to be saving a lot of money in the rehab cost.
Yeah. In fact, well, let me do this here. Give me just a second. I'm going to just grab that link you sent me here real quick, and I'm going to put that up here while we have a second, because I don't want to leave people too long without that. Oh, you're muted.
We're going to go ahead and go through the last category in structures, and then we're going to go look at an upcoming auction and start looking at some properties that are coming up for sale right now, do a quick evaluation of them, kind of go through a little bit of that first stage of due diligence where we go through those 6 steps of, viewing the property, making sure that it's available, checking out the assessor records, checking the market quickly, looking at all of those details to see, hey, is this a property that we want to move on in our research, and start doing stage 2 due diligence, which is really researching the title.
Yeah. Class 5, we would say your property is valued over 200,000, and we can pay upwards of 50%. You might even be able to pay higher than that a little bit, maybe 55%, to win a property. It could be worth it. But again, these properties, usually there's a specific reason we have for being willing to pay a high percentage like that. Like Steve was saying, if we have evidence that the property is, it's not going to need as many repairs, so we can tell that it's newer. So maybe let's see, properties that are built after the year 2000, might qualify for something like that, because again, we know that there's much less work we're going to need. At the very least, properties that are newer than what is it, like 1975 or so, 1978. Forget when they did some of the changes there, with building and with things like lead and asbestos. A lot of those things you can get out of the way there by the time you're in the mid 70s. But anything older than that, there's always the potential that you can run into a property that needs all kinds of work, and also needs to have all kinds of things removed. Things like things like lead paint and asbestos, maybe all over a property, if it's old enough. So yeah, if the property is new enough, though, that could be a reason why we're willing to pay a higher percentage of value. If the condition of the property is good enough, then it can increase the percentage of value that we're willing to pay. But it's still very much, though, value limited. If properties are valued between 100,000 and 200,000, it's not going to quite go up to probably 50%. It's probably going to be a little bit lower than that, probably closer to 40%. But where we see a lot of people make mistakes, though, is in paying a higher percentage of value, regardless of how much the property is worth. So we'll see people pay 50% of value or more, sometimes way more than 50% of value, which is almost never going to make sense, at least in terms of trying to make money. It's not really ever going to make sense because it's always going to make it hard for you to sell and limit your profitability.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, this example would be, one that's they probably paid a little bit more than we would have. But I think that there was reason for that. Part of it has to do with the fact that it's on 100 acres and the property value is just pulling the county assessed value. So we think that this property was probably worth an extra 50,000. It was probably closer to 275, 300 based on the land value. Many times the county on a big piece of land like this is going to tax the land at a lot lower rate, which means that they're going to have a lower assessed value. And so because of that, this property is probably worth 250 to 300. But even in there, you can see that they were willing to pay up because there was so much land involved. So even in this type of property, there's still $100,000 worth of potential profit, but that would be the very highest that we would ever go. And this one's probably higher than we would go, unless we did some real good research on that land to see how much big parcels of land like that are selling for. And also might even look into the possibility of subdividing it. Now, we're not going to call the city and go through all those methods right now, but we're going to look into the area a little bit, find out how hard it is to subdivide, because there can be money be made many times by subdividing this type of property and selling it into a couple of different pieces because it's such a big piece of land.
Yeah, that could definitely be a good option with acreage like this. Yeah, the acreage was really the most attractive thing about this property. The property itself seemed to be in decent shape, but somewhat overgrown, and certainly there might, it's probably going to need to be some investment there in order to get it up to a certain level of repair. But coming in at a bid that's roughly 50% of that is still a safe investment, especially if you think that if the valuation on it is low or under what you think it might be worth. You can see how the numbers would be great on that.
Yeah, and part of the reason I think they paid up for that particular home was because it was a newer home. We can see how kind of, it looks like it was overgrown. Maybe they haven't lived there for a while or used it very often. But the property, I think, was built within the last 20 years or so.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so that's kind of part of the reason I think that they were willing to pay up for it and how they probably still did a good deal on that one. So once we've determined exactly how much we're willing to pay for it, what the property is valued at, in fact, one of the steps in stage 3 due diligence is going through and determining actually what is the market value. Then we're going to calculate our max bid amount. We're going to estimate the price that we can pay for it, how much it's going to cost in rehab, what our profit margins are, and then we're going to stick and set a high bid amount and stick to that high bid amount. We see mistakes all the time where people are, bidding above high bid amounts, or most of the time don't even have a high bid amount. That's the way to lose money. That's the reason when we're working with our members, when we're training one-on-one with our coaching students, we're talking about setting that high bid amount and be willing to walk away. We walk away from properties. We know that it's hard for us. It's going to be hard for you to walk away from property that you put in some research, you put some time into it, but you're always going to be better off walking away than overpaying for a property, because there's always going to be another property available tomorrow and the day after that and another auction going on next week. So we'd rather look for another property than overpay for one that we've done some research on.
Yeah, so we generally set property maximum bids at a percentage of value. Is usually how we kind of set the amounts, and so depending on the property type and roughly how much it's worth, we kind of know about where our max might end up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're always going to go right to the max, because really it's property specific, what we're going to pay. But what the percentages do, though, with those numbers, it does give us an idea of what the maximum amount should be that we could pay if everything else on the property seemed great. And so, it works really well as kind of an outline to help us, understand the, the property values and what we're paying there on it. And it's also a good way to make sure that, that you're not paying too much. The people that tend to make the biggest mistakes are the ones that don't go in with a plan. They don't have a set amount. They're bidding to win. And that's really what you've got to watch out for. You can't get into a situation where you're bidding to win the property rather than bidding based on the numbers and based on profitability. That's an easy way to lose sight of it as well, is trying to win. And that's really what auctions rely on, is that desire to win. So yeah, don't hesitate to lose properties. We definitely lose a lot more than we ever win. We probably lose 10 times more than we win. But that's kind of the way it's supposed to work, especially if you're picking out the right properties, and if you're the ones you do win, you're going to win at pretty good prices.